Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you here to Belgravia Gallery tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce three very, very distinguished guests this evening, who all share a passion for the environment. Our first guest is Susan Swartz, who will be speaking about her paintings, and Louie Psihoyos, and then Bobby Kennedy Jr. These beautiful and very expressive works by Susan Swartz are very much admired, and this is the first time that they've been shown here in the United Kingdom. They're in a number of museums and galleries in the United States, and I think it's high time that we appreciated these beautiful, very colourful and semi-abstract works. And we will hear from Susan the remarkable story that out of sadness in her life, she was able to produce such incredible works. And so I'd like you all to give a round of applause for Susan.
Thank you so much, Anna. I have been painting for longer than I can remember, and professionally for longer than I care to admit. I have always found an inspiration for my work in nature. I love the contrast of its beauty. Linear, softly curvy, masculine, feminine, desolate, and abundant and full of life. For the first part of my career, I painted the beauty of nature as a tribute to its majesty. And then I got sick, very sick, with two separate diseases, each sparked by man's tampering with the natural world. When I was finally well enough to hold a paintbrush again, I did not resent nature for making me sick. On the contrary, I loved it all the more for its perfection and its balance, which we have had the audacity and the short-sightedness to alter. I loved nature so much that I became fiercely determined to see it preserved so that its pure, untainted wildness could continue to inspire us all. You might say that saving the natural environment became extremely personal to me. It's then that I began to think of myself as not only an artist, but a campaigner, when I had the good grace to meet two other visionary campaigners who I'm so proud to introduce you to this evening. Louie Psihoyos has worked fervently to alert us that all is not well with the world's oceans, arguably our most precious resource. He is the founder of the Oceanic Preservation Society and also the director of the award-winning film The Cove, which brought the world's attention to the systematic killing of dolphins in a small community in Japan and the treachery of the International Whaling Commission. I was also honored to work with Louie in a companion piece to The Cove called Mercury Rising. In the years since, Louie and his team have been working on a new documentary, Wake Up, that humanity is presiding over mass extinction. Robert Kennedy Jr. needs no introduction. His smart litigation tactics and his leadership in the International Waterkeepers Alliance, which protects rivers, waterways, and bays across the planet. He has authored 2 books and written many articles on environmental issues, ranging from the New York Times, Newsweek, Rolling Stone, and Outside Magazine. Bobby and I have partnered on numerous environmental campaigns over the past decade, and I'm so grateful to be able to call him friend. You see, environmental preservation is personal for Louie and Bobby as well. Their commitment to see the natural world cleaned up and preserved for future generations is a commitment we all share. Louie wields the camera, Bobby brings the law, and I inspire with a brush and a palette knife. This shared commitment should not stop just with the 3 of us. The beauty and the natural world is a birthright that we are all entitled to, but all are obligated to protect. The preservation of the planet is personal to each and every one of us. There is a wonderful writer and environmentalist who lived in the mountains and deserts of Utah, where I now make my home. Over half a century ago, this early environmentalist, Wallace Stegner, penned a wilderness letter, which is relevant today as it was then. He writes, We simply need that wild country available to us, even if we never do more than drive to its edge and look in. For it can be a means of reassuring ourselves of our sanity as creatures, a part of the geography of hope. Louie, Bobby, and I come to you today to argue that hope is exactly what we need in the environmental movement. Hope is not passive, waiting and wishing, but very active, walking forward with the commitment to make the world the one that we want to live in. Hope is a purposeful expectation of joy and goodness. Hope is all of us picking up whatever tool we have at our disposal and going to work. Now, will you please join me in welcoming Louie, whose own powerful work is both prophetic and relentlessly hopeful. Louie?
I always like to ask how many people have seen The Cove. There's a few. We can change a little bit of that. I've got about a couple dozen copies left. I'd like to fix that. There's this conceit, I think, that that art can change the world. And I really, when I was making that film, this is my first film I ever did. I made it with a group of friends, and none of us had made a film before. We had professional free divers. We had a guy that worked at the military for the Canadian Air Force. The joke on the set when we were in Taiji was that we're all professionals, just not at this. But that film went on to be one of probably the most decorated documentary in history. It won the first film to sweep all the guilds, won about 100 awards, over 100 awards from Sundance to the Academy Award. But I really felt, to be honest, I felt I was delusional when I made this film. I'd go from my home to the studio in the backyard and thought, well, geez, who am I to think I can make a film that it can change the world? But more importantly, that film has reduced the slaughter of dolphins and porpoises in Japan to about a third of what it was in just about a 3-year period. People always say, well, is it over with? Oh, no, but I don't know if the fight's ever over on these environmental issues. But the next film that the Cove is an eco thriller. It's a different kind of genre. It's not like it's not a doc like you normally see where they're shoveling information at you. It feels like a thriller. The next film that we're working on is also a thriller. We're bringing back the same team, with some new faces. We have a getaway driver. We have. And I'll tell you one way that this story got to me. It was to me, these, no matter if you're doing paintings or you're writing music or if you're making films, I think it's always about it's about moving people's emotions. That's what you try to do. I don't think anybody's going to nobody's going to get motivated to do anything unless you can get at their emotions. And the way that we're getting at the emotions with this next film, I wouldn't go to see a film on mass extinction of species caused by mankind. Is that what you would do on a date night? But I want to make this film a date film, and the way we're doing it is we're going to try to give people a sense of what's out there in the natural world. When we're looking at these paintings, we're looking at one little spectrum of light that's visible to the human eyes. I went to a researcher. We got into the Cove with using a technology called forward-looking infrared. It's the military uses. You're not supposed to take the cameras out of the country, but we did. That's how we could see the guards at the Cove in Japan. These guys that make this technology are making a new camera so we can see carbon and methane, the atmospheric gases that are destroying the planet. Last weekend, I was in Santa Barbara, and one of the researchers that was doing this said, it's like everything that's visible to humanity, it's like you're seeing one note on a grand piano, but there's all this other spectrum out there. And human beings we're only seeing a little part of the world, and we're only hearing even a smaller part of it. And let me give you an idea about the working title of this next film is called The Singing Planet. And that's because one of the researchers we met said, the whole world's been singing, we just haven't been listening. Everything from insects up to blue whales. And I'll tell you how I found this guy. I think it's an extraordinary story. I hope you have a minute for it. But when I first started the Cove, a good friend of mine, the guy that started Netscape, Silicon Graphics, WebMD, serial entrepreneur, let me use his boat to go anywhere I want in the world on an expedition. He said, where do you want to go? Who do you want to invite? I can't go on it. And I said, my God, it had the 300-foot sailboat, like everybody's dream. I said, I want to go to Silver Banks. It's where most of the humpback whales from the North Atlantic come to congregate. And it's out in the middle of the ocean, away from anywhere. And he said, who do you want to bring? I said, Roger Payne. He's the guy that discovered that humpback whales are singing. In the late 1960s, early 1970s. Imagine that humanity has gone almost 2 million years. It depends on what you consider your ancestor, like the Anthropocene, the little, like Lucy, the little pre-humans. But, imagine that we've gone almost 2 million years on this planet, and we didn't know that one of the biggest animals in the world was singing. And so I got to the Silver Banks with Roger Payne, the older gentleman now. He's about 75 years old, and he puts at night he puts hydrophones over the boat, and the whales would serenade us as we were eating dinner. And it was just the most beautiful thing, because it's only the males that sing, and they sing all over the Silver Banks, and there's hundreds of them, and you can hear them in different dimensions because we were listening in stereo. And I said, Roger, how far can these animals hear song? And he said, well, let me tell you this story. I wrote a paper, he said, back in the 1970s that said that theorized that these animals could probably hear themselves sing over hundreds of miles. And I thought, well, he said that almost got him, that did get him laughed out of the scientific community. For 10 years, he couldn't get another paper published. He said what saved him was his first graduate student, Chris Clark. Chris was brought in by the military. The U.S. Navy has this big underwater surveillance system called SOSUS. And that's how they were listening in the Cold War for submarines. They have a big string of, they call it like a string of pearls, but hydrophones on the mid-Atlantic ridge, and they can direct it anywhere in the ocean that they want. Now, a commander for SOSUS called up Chris Payne, Roger Payne's first student, and said, can you try to figure out we have a crazy Ivan, and we want you to figure out what it's doing. This is a submarine run by a captain from the Russian military that would go like 6 or 7 minutes in one direction, and then it would disappear and do another one to drive invasive maneuvers. Chris is brought in with Secret Service clearance into like an underground bunker with 100 people, and they're all listening to the oceans in real time. A big map on the front wall. And the commander puts these headphones on Chris, and Chris goes, that's not a submarine, that's a fin whale. It's pinging the oceans every 70 seconds, just like your submarines, because that's how it's finding its way around. It disappears every 7 minutes because it has to come up to breathe. And Chris realizes at this time that these people are listening to the whole Atlantic Ocean in real time. So he tries to test Roger's theory. He says, do you mean if I go to the end of this room, it's the last guy at the desk, he's listening to the Southern Atlantic? He says, yeah. He says, 15 minutes later, Chris put on the headphones, they could hear the same fin whale talking to another one thousands of miles away. And Roger said that's how blue whales, find food. They do is they basically sing they're not gregarious by nature, they're solitary, but they go down to the Southern Atlantic and then they look for food. Chris asked the commander, says, how far can a blue whale sing? Because they have like a 240 decibel song. Here's what's amazing about a blue whale song. You can't hear it, even though it's the loudest song in the animal kingdom, 240 decibels, but it's below our level for hearing. So if you're in the water, you can hear it, you can feel it. It vibrates you. And Chris asked the commander to do a back of the napkin calculation of how far these animals could hear themselves singing. He said, 13,000 miles. They've evolved to actually hear themselves clear around the other side of the planet, in the deepest part of the ocean, where it's in the Southern Ocean, where it's not blocked by landmass. Roger Payne had aired, but on the wrong side of air. These animals have been evolved to sing completely around the world. I went to visit Chris Clark over at the Cornell Bioacoustic Laboratory. It's the biggest repository of animal songs on the planet. And he played these songs for me that were spectacular, like a bearded seal. Sounds like a barking dog on the surface. Underwater, it sounds like a Mongolian throat singer singing in several octaves at the same time. You'd think it was done with a computer and a synthesizer. It was just extraordinary stuff. Then he played me the song of a male oo. This is a bird that would mate for life. And she would sing and he would sing. And he played only one half of this recording because he said this is the last male of a species singing for a female that will never come. He said this is going on 30,000 times a year. We're losing species right now faster than our ability to even record that they're here. He said we're going through a mass extinction crisis that hasn't been seen since the KT extinction, the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, the one that killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. A friend of mine, Michael Novacek, I did 4 stories on the Mesozoic for National Geographic. I wrote a book on the Mesozoic. That's the midlife of the planet. It's the age from the Permian, the end of the last big era. It's basically the age of dinosaurs. And I went to visit a good friend of mine, the provost of the American Museum of Natural History, and Michael Novacek, who runs the museum, said, yeah, it's like humanity it's like Vishnu, destroyers of life. And there's another friend of mine said, though, we're one step away from greatness or disaster. And I thought, and Michael says, Michael's in touch with all some of the richest people in New York. I said, why can't you get this word out? And he says, well, it's too dire. It says, people don't want to hear this. And I thought, well, I'm going to make a film about it. I'm going to try to, and what we're going to do at the end of the film is going to be really, really bold and audacious. We have sound lasers that we're going to put on the tops of New York skyscrapers, and we're going to aim these lasers, the songs of endangered creatures, down to the streets of Manhattan. Tony Malkin, who owns the Empire State Building, is allowing us to use his structure, to project videos of these animals that are on the brink of extinction. There's 55 Maui dolphins left. There's about 300 vaquita in the northern part of the Baja. There's these animals all over the planet. They're just hanging on by their fingernails for existence. They need people to help them. Most people in this room, how many people here knew that there's a mass extinction event going on? One, Bobby, of course. Shut up, Bobby. No, I think we're at this apex where the people in this room, the people outside, the people who are alive right now are the only people that can change this. By the time your kids are up and able to do something, it's going to be too late. It's up to us. And to me, that is not demoralizing. It's empowering. The idea that there's the people that are alive right now are the ones that can really change the world. At OPS, we live by this maxim that Margaret Mead said. She said, a few thoughtful citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I believe that. I believe that, everybody in this room, everybody has the power to be great. I mean, we all aspire to that. We all live for that. That's what gets me up every day, is that hope that we can change the world, that we can leave the place at least as good as we found it. I mean, isn't that what you do when you go to somebody else's places to stay? If you get invited to somebody's house, you don't unpack your bags expansively. You don't leave dirty dishes in. You don't make a mess of yourself. And humanity's not doing that. We're not leaving the place as good as we found it. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But I do think that films can change the world. I've said that films like a weapon of mass construction. It's the opposite of dropping a bomb, where you make corpses. You actually create allies. And I've seen this ripple effect go out with making a film, that you inspire people, that when you do something like a film like The Cove or The Last Mountain that Bobby did, you have a chance over a 90-minute period to change the world. And I made a concerted effort when we made that film to make every frame count. We went back and we spent 3 weeks just getting rid of 3 minutes that were extraneous. And I just want to make sure that when everybody sees the film, that they're, this next film, I think I want it to make it to be really, really beautiful. When you hear the songs of these animals, it's just so inspirational. And to think that it's the last time you might ever hear them. I don't know. I think, I look around the walls and I think, well, when I go to Susan's house and I see this art, I get filled up. When I hear music, I get filled up. When I see films or read, books, it fills me up. That's what I'm trying to do, is inspire people. And if anybody wants to see some clips of the next film, give me your business card and I'll shoot you some clips. But I'd love to show you some more stuff when you get a chance. But give the podium back over to Bobby. But I can't wait to hear what you say, Bobby. I think he's one of the best speakers that there is. So I feel like, it's time to wrap up. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Louie. And I said this at lunch to a group of people who we spoke to this afternoon, they were a lot of some of the heavy hitters from the venture capital and growth equity movement. I'm a partner in the biggest green tech venture capital firm in our country. I told a story. We got a very, very early director's, or an early cut, uncut version of The Cove I think it was 2 years ago in Hyannisport, with a lot of Kennedys. And it was in August, and there were 85 Kennedys who came to the screening at my brother's house. And most of them were little kids. And they also brought their friends who were from the same town. And Hyannisport has two kinds of people in it, Democrats and Republicans. And it's actually the most Republican town if it weren't for us, in the country. But it was the only town in the state of Massachusetts that President Kennedy lost in the 1960 presidential campaign. My grandfather moved there in 1920 because there was a golf course that was run by an Irishman, and he could not get into golf courses anywhere else in the state. So he went there because he was a scratch golfer, and he loved to. When he was ambassador here in England, one of the things that really made him kind of beloved for the beginning of his ambassadorship here was on his second day as ambassador, he scored a hole-in-one at the Stokes Page Golf Club. And these kids, they were, a lot of them, they brought all the kids in Hyannisport were there, and there was a couple of hundred people in the room, and they saw this film, and Louie was was probably the best photographer in the history of National Geographic, and he hadn't done a film before, but he had a brilliant sense of aesthetics, and as it turns out, of how to tell a story. The film is not like any documentary you've ever seen. It's like it's like the kind of thing you'd see if the Navy SEALs had made a film of how they got Osama bin Laden, because they used these. I think there was actually military people involved in sneaking the equipment into the country, and filming this thing that people literally wanted to kill them for filming. For Japan, it was a huge state secret, and it's a tremendous, exciting, riveting story that that these 4, 5, 7, 10, 12-year-olds, and it radicalized these children. And I, at the time, afterwards, I wanted to go over to Japan with Louie and do something public about this. And all these kids wanted to come with me, and they got permission. They said their parents would pay for their tickets, and they'd work for them or do whatever. But it really changed their attitudes and radicalized them. And it really showed me, for one of the first times, the power of film. And I'm really excited about this next film, because I think that that mass extinctions, it should not be a partisan issue. It's an issue that our children should know about, and they should hold us responsible for. And we should be. It should be shown in every school, whatever you produce, and they should be given a chance to object to the way that we're running things now. I want to thank Susan and Jim for having me here and for their friendship. And I'll just tell you a little bit about my organization. When we wrote the environmental laws in our country, we wrote 28 environmental laws after Earth Day, and in each one we included a citizen supervision. It said that if the government fails to enforce the law, if somebody is committing a criminal act, and pollution is crime, it's real crime. And it destroys the oceans, it destroys the commons, mercury, we know, causes brain damage. And it's one of the things that linked Louie and Susan and myself, is that we all found out that we had mercury poisoning around the same time. Me from eating fish. But a single molecule of mercury can, we now know, can cause IQ loss in human beings, and particularly in the prenatal stages, can cause dramatic IQ loss. And I actually was told that the levels I have, which are 10 times what EPA considers safe, were enough. If a woman had them, that her children would have permanent cognitive impairment. And we're living in a science fiction nightmare in our country, where my children and the children of most Americans can now no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing with their father and mother in the local fishing hole and come home and safely eat the fish. And it's mainly because somebody gave money to a politician and corrupted, where there's a democracy and the environment are intertwined, and wherever you see large-scale environmental injury, you'll also see the subversion of democracy. And that's, the fact that we've got so much mercury. According to CDC, 1 out of every 6 American women now has dangerous levels of mercury in her womb. And what we're doing to the oceans today to rob our children of that bounty, through ocean acidification. Louie was talking at lunch that in the Seattle area, that oystermen have not been able to grow oyster spat, baby oysters, for the past 5 or 7 years. So, how long? 7 years, because the oceans are becoming acidified, because that carbon that we're putting in the air that's also causing ocean level rising and global warming is doing something that to me is much more frightening. And the group, we have 200 water keepers around the world. We're growing exponentially now. We're the fastest growing water protection group in the world. But the movement was started on the Hudson River back in in 1966, and it was started by a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen who mobilized to reclaim the river from its polluters. We have in the Hudson the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. It used the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam and then passed down through the generations. One of the enclaves of the commercial fishery on the Hudson is a little village called Crotonville, New York, that's 30 miles north of New York City on the east bank of the river. And the people who lived in Crotonville were not your prototypical, affluent, tweed-jacketed, pipe-smoking environmentalists. They were factory workers and carpenters and lathers and electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or at least some part of it, fishing or crabbing the Hudson. These were people who had little expectation they'd ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone or the national parks. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches and swimming holes and fishing holes of the Hudson River. It was their property values. It was their livelihoods. In 1964, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton Harmon Rail Yard, and the oil went up the river on the tides and blackened the beaches and made the shad taste of diesel so that they couldn't be sold to the Fulton Fish Market in the city. And all of the people in Crotonville came together in the only public building in the town, which was the American Legion Hall. This is a very patriotic community. Crotonville had the highest mortality rate of any community in the United States during World War II. Virtually the entire male population joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor, and almost all of the original board members and officers and members of Riverkeeper were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II in Korea. These weren't radicals, they weren't militants, they were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. And by this evening in March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters. And the only way that they were going to reclaim the river for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And a guy stood up whose name was Bob Boyle, and he was another Korean War vet. He was the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated magazine, and he's still there today. He's been there for 65 years. He was a famous angler in America. He'd written 6 books on fly fishing and spin fishing. He was one of the gurus of dry fly tying in our country. 2 years before, he had written an article about angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated, and in researching it, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught, but also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And he sent a copy of the law over to the libel lawyers at Time Inc., which owned Sports Illustrated, and he said, is this still good law? They sent him a memo back saying in 80 years, it's never been enforced, but it's still on the books and it's good law. And that evening, when all these men, 300 men and women in the American Legion Hall, stayed there till 1:30 in the morning, he stood up in front of them talking about violence. He stood up in front of them with a copy of the law and the memo, and he said, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law. We should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that night that they were going to start a group that was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, later became Riverkeeper. they were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they shut down the Penn Central Pipe. They got to keep $2,000, which was a huge amount of money, in Crotonville, New York in 1968. There were 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town, and they used the money that was left over to go after Ciba Geigy and Tuck Tape and Standard Brands and American Sentiment, the biggest corporations in America, and they won these lawsuits. And 1973, they collected $200,000, the biggest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter, from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics at Hastings, New York. They used bounty money to build a boat, which today patrols the river, tracking down polluters. They used bounty money in 1983 to hire their first full-time riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin. He hired me a year later as the prosecuting attorney for the group. And I was working for DA in Manhattan, but I always knew I was going to spend my life working on environmental issues. We started suing polluters, and since then we've brought over 400 successful lawsuits on the Hudson. We forced polluters to spend $5 billion remediating the river, and as a result of those expenditures in our work, today the Hudson is an international model for ecosystem protection. This was a water, there was a national joke in 1966. It was dead water for 20-mile stretches north of New York City, south of Albany. It caught fire, it turned colors, depending on what color they were painting the trucks at the GM plant in Tarrytown. Today, it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre or biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator, and it's the last major river system left on both sides of the Atlantic that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. So it's Noah's Ark. It's a species warehouse. It's the last refuge for many of these animals that are going extinct elsewhere. One of the things that holds this movement together is this idea, and I want to mention this because of these beautiful paintings, is that the reason that we protect the environment is not so much because for the sake of the fishes and the birds. And these fishermen understood that. They were small business people whose lives were dependent on a clean environment. But it went beyond that. That they understood that that the environment is the infrastructure of our communities, and that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a nation, as a civilization, which is to create communities for our children that provide them with the same opportunities for dignity and enrichment and prosperity and good health as the communities that our parents gave us, we've got to start by protecting our environmental infrastructure, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the wildlife, the fishery, the public lands, those things that are not susceptible to private property ownership, but by their nature are the possession of the entire community, the shared possession of the entire community, what we call the commons. And we're sitting across right now from Hyde Park, which is one of the most famous commons in the world, or the Commonwealth, or the public trust assets, the air, water, wildlife, fisheries. And when I look at these paintings, and this is part of a great tradition of American landscape painting. And after the American Revolution, Americans were really asking the question, who are we as a people? We're not European anymore, but we're not really American Indians. And so who the heck are we? And the answer came back from this extraordinary group of people, from Emerson Thoreau, who started that philosophers camp up in the Adirondacks, and from the other poets, and Andrew Jackson Downing and Frederick Olmsted, who was the first one to design for city parks because he wanted Americans to be in contact with their wilderness. But most importantly, with these landscape painters, Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, Samuel F.B. Morse, what they call the Hudson River School, Bierstadt, Cropsey. And they painted these indomitable landscapes where any evidence of humanity was kind of ant-like and in ruins. And the message that they were trying to tell us, our architecture became Greek because that was where democracy came from. So if you see all the public buildings in America, they have a Greek theme to them. But they said, but we started developing public parks, and our artists focused on wilderness. And they said, you don't have to be ashamed because you don't have the 1,500 years of culture that they have in Europe, because you have this relationship to the land, and particularly wilderness, which is the undiluted work of the Creator. And that's going to be the source of your values and virtues and your character as a people. Frederick Jackson Turner, who was our greatest American historian, said that in America, democracy came out of the forests. Without these vast tracts of wilderness, we wouldn't have evolved the government institutions and the institutions of democracy in the way that they evolved. So these people understood that it was more than their economy that it was at stake. It was something that went directly to our values. They also understood the notion of the commons, and this is something that British people should understand. But this is because every state in the United States, the Constitution of my state of New York and of Massachusetts and every other state says the people of the state own the waterways of the state, and they own the fisheries, and they own the air. And that these are part of the commons, and they own them. They're not owned by the governor, the legislature. They're not owned by the coal companies. They're not owned by the big corporations. They're owned by the people. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody can use them in a way that will diminish or injure their use and enjoyment by others. And this is ancient law. It goes back to Roman times. It's in the Code of Justinian. When Roman law broke down in Europe, every local jurisdiction and little kingdom, the kings and feudal lords began privatizing the public trust. For example, here in England, King John said that the deer and the other game animals no longer belonged to the public, that only the nobility, his friends, could hunt them. And he said, and this was a social safety net for the people of England. If you were starving, you could go out and shoot a deer, but that was taken away from you. And he erected navigational tolls on the Thames and the other rivers of England, so that what was once free, going up and down the river, taking food to your family or doing commerce, now you had to pay for it. And he sold monopolies to all of the fisheries of England to wealthy individuals and friends. So that, again, it's another social safety net. You could, if you're starving, you could go down and catch a fish. Now you had to pay somebody for that privilege. And this caused the public, led by the barons, to rise up and confront him on the Battle of Runnymede, where there's a memorial to my uncle, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which is the Bethlehem of all of our Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution. But also, there were provisions in the Magna Carta, which you can go look up on the internet tonight, that guarantee free access to fisheries, to navigable waters, and other parts of the commons to every citizen of England. And it was a basic, essential human right. And those rights descended to the people of our country when we had the revolution in our country. And a lot of times I'll sit across a table from a polluter who I'm suing, during negotiations. And they'll say, well, you can't really hold me, my feet to the fire for filling that wetland, because when we did it, we didn't know we weren't supposed to. The word hadn't gotten to us. These are a bunch of new laws that were drafted by hippies in tie-dye T-shirts after Earth Day, and we haven't got used to them yet, so you got to give us some time. But actually, it's always been illegal to destroy the commons. As I said, since Roman times, it was illegal to pollute in our country in every jurisdiction up to 1847. But I'm not going to go in. This whole talk has turned into a digression, and I'm not going to go there, although I really want to. To treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, to convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, to have a few years of pollution-based prosperity. We can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy. We can make a few people billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they'll never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the costs of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children. The point that I've made for 30 years, people have said to me, what's the most important thing that you can do? We could do a single piece of legislation to protect the environment. And I've always said the same thing, which is to have true free market capitalism, because which we don't have. We have monopoly capitalism and corporate crony capitalism, and the free market capitalism is the most powerful economic engine that's ever been devised, but it has to be harnessed to a social purpose. Otherwise, it's going to lead us inexorably down the road of monopoly capitalism and plutocracy and oligarchy and corporate kleptocracy. And in a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for the rest of us, for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. And what we do in the Waterkeeper movement, we don't even consider ourselves to be environmentalists. We're free marketeers. We go out into the marketplace to ensure the integrity of our system of free market capitalism. And what we have to understand in Great Britain, the United States, and throughout the rest of the world is that there's a huge difference between free market capitalism, which makes a nation more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism which we've now embraced across the board in our country, which is as antithetical to efficiency, prosperity, and democracy in America as it is in Nigeria. And so these aren't just, environmental issues these are issues about our democracy. These are issues about our moral authority, about the duties we owe to future generations. And the Swartzes, Jim and Susan, understand that. And I felt like from the moment I met them, kindred spirits. And he's devoted his life to trying to, and his talents at making money and making companies work and creating prosperity, but also to make our culture responsible and humane and to reflect the values that our country's supposed to represent as a exemplary nation. And that's a phrase that's been misused a lot, but it's one that I think what it means is that we've got to meet our obligation to our children and to the rest of the world to behave well. And Abraham Lincoln said, America is a great nation because we're a good nation, and that if we ever stop being a good nation, we'll quickly forfeit our greatness as well. And that's what Susan's doing, that's what Jim's doing, that's what Brian's doing, and that's what I'm trying to do with my life. And I thank all of you for coming here and welcome you, and hope you'll be part of this fist fight. Thank you very much.